That's not just because I like speaking, I actually like to talk, but it's also because my first job ever when I was 25 was in New Zealand. And I'll show you that, so you can see blast from the past. I started as an environmental scientist with Opus, and I was very pleased to see that Opus is one of your members, so that means that, you know, it's good to start your career there. And I worked on waste management in hospitals, and you see me there pulling the waste apart. Energy efficiency, water. And the second job I had was I was being seconded to the Ministry for Environment for about a year in Wellington. So for me it's memory lane, coming back feels a little bit like home, and I know Kiwis are always very welcome to people, but for me it's a double special. And I want to thank ICA and New Zealand Sustainable Business Council for inviting me. I'm really, really happy to be here, and I hope I'm going to do you proud in trying to dump my brain on you when it comes to logistics. Because what we're seeing in freight and logistics is that this sector is going through a massive growth. The predictions are that especially in developing countries, we're going to be looking at up to 430% increase by 2050. And in China alone, 2 million trucks were sold last year, which is like 15% of the total fleet. It's very inefficient as well. As percentage of logistics cost in the West is about 10%, in Indonesia it's 27%, making logistics the bottleneck of economic growth. And there's a high impact. Not only is it a high percentage of transport fuel, but logistics do generate at least 6% of global carbon emissions, and diesel emissions cause cancer. There's all the reason to do something about it. And is nothing happening? Yes, there is. But the challenge was, and that's why I started the Smart Freight Center, the initiatives are scattered. They focus on one aspect of logistics, or they focus on one country, or on only fuels, or only technologies, or only one mode, like marine freight. And as a result, a lot of the efforts that are happening now collectively are not as effective than if they would be working together. So the reason why I started Smart Freight Center, and by the way, I spoke to every single one of these before I started, is that there is a lack of capacity within the sector to address it. The standards for calculating emissions are missing. The coordination between initiatives could be better. We see a leadership need, infrastructure, policies, confidence in technologies, collaboration between businesses, like what Abby was also explaining, what she's trying to address, and access to financing. And because we see these barriers happening, there's not an uptake of at-scale options that otherwise make total business sense. So the reason why I set up Smart Freight Center 3 years ago as a global NGO was to lead the way to a more efficient freight and logistics sector, really by focusing on the market barriers that businesses face to realize this potential. And the 3 areas we focus on is, first, we're looking at leadership, and because we believe, for me, partnership is a new leadership. And so we're looking at what does leadership mean and how can we foster collaboration among businesses, but also between different players like government, business and civil society, and between countries. So I'm hoping that in the next month I'm going to be able to make a lot of linkages with other countries for you too. Second, we created a global methodology framework for calculating emissions, and I have a few flyers in the back on that essentially will become the standard for calculating CO2 emissions for this sector, and that allows companies who are moving freight across the global supply chain to calculate one way consistently across modes and across countries. And finally, the Smart Trucks platform. Of all the modes, road freight is where most help is needed. There are a lot of initiatives already on marine freight and air freight, for example, but road freight is very fragmented. It is the most cutthroat part of the freight sector, and carriers just need help in getting more efficient and, of course, trying to keep the profits for themselves. So what are we aiming at? Well, our vision is a more efficient and environmentally sustainable global freight and logistics sector, although I often put environment between brackets because very often road safety comes at play as well. So how can that vision be realized? Well, first we'll need a business perspective. You need to put freight, the logistics sector, at the center. Business needs to be the center, and governments, private sector and civil society need to support this sector. Unlike passenger transport, where often you put the consumer or the people at the center and everybody helps, freight is exactly the other way around. And that's also why so many initiatives have gone wrong, because they've taken a government-centric approach and not a business-centric approach. Second is then, as part of this is that, and this is my theory of change, is that if we are able to influence the large, say, top 150 multinationals that transfer goods around the world, and get them across the supply chain to change behavior, this sector will change forever. And what's needed for that is to help them that they set ambitious emission reduction targets, and I'm talking about 30% or more. Measure, report and verify emissions, identify actions to reduce them, collaborate and exchange with other companies, because this sector is so fragmented, you cannot do this alone. And finally, engage proactively in policy development. My firm belief is that to lobby against any policy, against regulation, is old days. We need good policy and good regulation. We need a level playing field in this sector, and we need a fair treatment of the players in this sector, otherwise it won't work. Now, and with that, we need to make sure then that this generates business value as well as social value. Many companies talk to me, they want to do something on climate change, but unless it makes a buck, they can't do it, and that's only fair. So when we then, the second condition is that we have leadership and collaboration for transformational change that involves government creating an enabling environment, businesses driving smart freight, civil society putting it on the agenda and raising the bar, and consumers finally, we need to find ways to get consumers to consider the impact of goods transport in their purchasing decision. And the third condition is that we link it to the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. And I threatened to tell New Zealand off, but then I heard that because of that, they ratified the Paris Agreement yesterday, so that's very good. Congratulations. And I'm sure that because of New Zealand, we now have passed the mark of 55 countries and 55% of global emissions, right? And secondly, Sustainable Development Goals, which have been agreed by multi-stakeholders. These are the things that are going to drive sustainability over the next decade. And if you can hook efforts on freight and logistics in that agenda, you stand a bigger chance of being heard and taking things to scale. And finally, we need a framework. And this framework is what we developed. We called it the Smart Freight Leadership Framework. And it builds on what I just said before. Is the carrier-shipper relationship. They need to do certain actions, but they need to be supported by the rest of society and delivering business value and social value. And as a result, we have a more efficient sector. So now I want to talk a little bit about delivering the vision. I've put a lot of things on my slides also because I want to leave them with you. So to give you enough links and information for you to continue learning about this. First is then setting targets. We did a review of some of the companies and we're finding that business do set targets, but they're inconsistent. And in both the way how they express them as well as the amount of emissions they're planning to reduce. And because they express this intensity, you don't know if the real emissions are going to reduce. And in combination with that, is very few countries have now set targets for freight. But the moment they start doing that, it's inconsistent with business. How do we know if we're going to go anywhere near saving the coral reefs? Yeah. So to give an example where I think it's done really well is Japan. They have a national target of 25% by 2030. And they've really got a comprehensive policy package of voluntary programs, standards, financial incentives, really, really comprehensive, including for the freight sector. But they then translated it that each carrier that has more than 200 trucks and each shipper that transports more, that has a value of more than 30 million ton-kilometer, they must reduce 1% on average per year. And by setting it as something tangible, and it allows business to see, right, government setting the north, that's what we're aiming for. And I think it's quite practical. So what we need on targets is a common methodology to set them. We need to make sure that the requirements for target setting is consistent amongst the different green freight programs and initiatives that exist. And finally, we need to align them between countries, modes, cities, and companies, because right now that's not the case. The second one, and this is what my first task was when I started the Smart Freight Center, is we said, imagine you would have one methodology that allows you to calculate emissions across the global supply chain in a consistent way. in a way that works for business. So you can look at it academically, but in the end we work back, what are the decisions and what are the reporting that businesses need to make? And what type of data do they need for them? And how accurate should it be? And if academically we could make it more accurate, that doesn't matter. We strive for it, but it does not really matter. So that's what our starting point was. And the starting point was also to involve the companies, the associations and the initiatives around the world that have already been working on emissions accounting. So by bringing them all in the same room, we were able to pull together the existing methodologies and fill the gaps. And here you see it. You see that we've got methodologies for different modes, and they build on the ones that are already out there. So for example, the Clean Cargo Working Group has been developing one for container freight. That initiative has existed 12 years. So they are 14 years, so they know what they're talking about. And what we did is to make sure that the consistency between sea freight and road freight is now there. Yeah? And we did the same for other methodologies. It was endorsed by the World Resources Institute, so we now carry the Greenhouse Gas Protocol mark. And what we need next is we need to make sure it gets adopted by different companies and by countries. So I was in China just now, last week, also talking about China making a standard for logistics emissions accounting that builds on what we developed. It would be fantastic. But one big barrier right now is data. A lot of companies say they now want to measure, but they lack the data from carriers. And I'm not sure who of you two, I think you mentioned it, that just like companies don't want to show off about how much they save, they also don't want to share the data. Because if they share the data about fuel, their customers have insight in their margins, and they're going to bring them down even more. So there's a real commercial barrier to sharing data. And finally, we need incentives and support mechanisms, guidance, training, policy, and research. So what we've achieved is, because we now have one standard for emissions accounting, that if a government mandates emissions reporting, at least it's done in a consistent way. The next one is about implementing actions. And some people say, oh, let's go electric, or let's do modal shift, or let's do something just on trucks. And I say, no, we need it all. If you put this down, it's about a third across, maybe a little bit more to one or the other, but it's about a third for each. Only if we do a concerted effort across the board do we stand any chance of reaching, what was it, more than 40% of emission reductions that we need to get to. And the three categories that we've made is vehicles, vessels, and fuels. The second is about moving freight. And the third is about the transport system. And the one on the left is where carriers have the most opportunity to control and make the decisions themselves. So that's why ECA's program is really geared towards carriers doing that. Whereas on the transport system, you are dependent on government and other players. Yeah, then the question I keep getting is which of the actions are now new and we should think of, and I don't have enough time to go through in detail, so I just made a few slides to just show what's been happening. Obviously, truck technologies are maybe not the most sexy area to look at, but it is really, really, really needed. And especially in developing countries, this is really the starting point, I find. Alternative fuels, which applies not just for road, but also for air and for sea. In the ocean sector, we see slow steaming, low sulfur fuel, cold ironing, so that's like using electricity while you're in the harbor. Vehicle emission standards, whether that's making standards tighter, or for example starting to ban trucks that don't meet a certain emission standard from city standards. And yeah, the one that I always like is the different type of trucks. I've been sitting in quite a few of those trucks. I'm a real trucking fan now. Long trucks, platooning, so there's multiple trucks, one after the other, and self-driving trucks. So the one at the bottom, that's a photo I took in the port of Rotterdam. On freight movement, what we're really seeing is a number of logistics platforms. And last week I was in China, and there's at least 4 or 5 of these platforms starting every week now. They also close down as quickly because not all of them have the right formula, but it just shows the impressive interest in, if we're able to fill that empty space, that air that we're now carrying in the trucks, if we're able to fill that, we can actually save a lot of money. The other one is convertible trucks, which I met these people, they're from Canada. And what they've done, they've really looked at automotive industry, where you see that if cars are taken one direction, on the way back they're empty. But what they've done, they've designed trucks that if you now you can convert the one at the top to the one at the bottom, and as a result you can put containers on the way back. And one of the companies that's very interested is, for example, Procter & Gamble, who are trying to find people who have an empty backload for them to put their stuff onto, because if they do, then it's like half the price. It's really, really cutting their costs. And what you start seeing is more and more container models, like you have containers for sea freight, you see the same happening now for road, and ideally container sizes that can go from a truck onto a rail or into an airplane in a consistent manner. And I spoke to a gentleman before, went to the transport fair in Germany a few weeks ago, and I'm sure there were lots of technologies like about transport management system, software to stack loads into trucks, and the pallets with little scanners so you can actually track and trace individual pallets. Now that already provides an opportunity for better data. And then there's the more sexy stuff like 3D printing. 3D printing won't just it allows you to manufacture goods at the location where you sell it, but what's a really big first opportunity, I think, is the use of spare parts. So if you order a spare part now, you have to wait for the goods to be delivered. Like if you're in Wellington, it needs to be shipped down from Auckland. But if you've got a 3D printer in a neighborhood and you've got a network of those spare parts can be printed right where you live. And that's a huge potential. And I just bumped into one company in the Netherlands who started a business on this. And finally, logistics supply chain optimization, changing the routing in a more efficient way can save 10 to 20%. Finally, the transport system. So we're seeing modes and electrification of urban freight. The DHL boat is driving in Amsterdam. It comes into the city, and then once it reaches the shore, you have these bullet bikes that take the parcels all around town. And they can move to different places. It's like a bus stop. And those bikes will just follow and then redistribute. It's really, really innovative. Bicycle, that one is from Paris. And of course, you see more and more hybrids and electric trucks. New modes, I'll talk a little bit later in my second presentation about the flying zeppelin, as I call it. And of course, you see drones, although I've yet to see the case of drones for fuel efficiency. Actually, one of the logistics service providers confided in me that it actually costs a third more energy to get things delivered by drone. So it's more an innovation, but not one that might help our cause. You get different ways of regrouping freight or consolidating freight, such as cross-docking platforms. And finally, modal shift and synchromodality. Modal shift means you go from a truck to a train, or from a delivery van to a bike. Synchromodality means that you have multiple options available to you at every leg of transport, and that you can think, hey, today we need to get something transport, we can take or the truck, or the train, or the boat, whichever is at that time more convenient. And that's really a new way of thinking and trying to optimize the availability of multiple modes. Now, another one for implementation is if you see the shippers, if they want to do something, they depend on subcontracted carriers to do the right thing. And let's face it, guys, these are big barriers that these companies are facing, especially market forces. If you're constantly being pressed to reduce costs, you start thinking about tomorrow and not about next week, let alone about next year. The lack of planning, the lack of investment is so big that in a way this industry is now set up to kill itself. And I really think that the barriers is what we really need to focus on. So the elephant in the room, do cargo owners really care? And if they do, are there ways to get them together and to work, which is why I'm so happy you issued this, the procurement guides, because it is about let's raise the floor together and make the sector more sustainable collectively, instead of giving up and saying, well, it's just always run like this, let's not change it. We have to change it. So what's needed? A better business case for the carriers, but also for the shippers to realize that what you mentioned, the best value partnership is better than just costs. More initiatives dedicated to help carriers improve the barriers. So I think your initiative is really good. I think you put a few umbrellas with it, but I think really the right direction. And map the government research and support that carriers get. So right now it's often a labyrinth of subsidies, policies, initiatives, training, and many companies don't have time already, let alone to try and figure out where they can get help. And this is something I think the Business Council could do a job. Collaborate and exchange, you've got different parts. So you can have open collaboration where a company says, ask someone else, can you help me out? But you also got vertical collaboration between shippers, LSPs and carriers. And finally, you got horizontal ones. And the horizontal one is multi-stakeholder, and this is what's going to shift this sector. My second presentation is about that, so I won't go into detail. The one that I wanted to highlight is the role of green freight programs. Green freight programs are set up to help carriers and shippers improve their fuel efficiency and reduce costs. And the areas where I mentioned before that are needed, I'm working with the UN-led Climate and Clean Air Coalition to make sure that the components of these green freight programs are made consistent around the world. And what we need a better understanding of what collaboration means and what types there are. So when I just landed in New Zealand, we had this discussion, and the moment I talked about collaboration, the first thing I heard was, but it's competition, we can't interfere with competition. And I thought, hang on, there's so many ways of collaborating possible, but you're not even talking about competition, you talk about pre-competition, or you're talking about shippers who operate an entirely different business. The second one is I really think you need a greater role for civil society, and I consider Business Council being one of them, and ICA in a way too, but a neutral facilitator to make these collaborations happen. And finally, promote alignment between initiatives because they all have something to offer. Together they have to offer a lot more. Now finally, the difficult one is the policy. So I'm not sure, every country I get a different feedback. So in China I get, you must work with government. In India I hear, don't work with government. And here I hear a little bit, we want to work with government, but we can't push them too hard. So I'm not sure if I've got the right assessment. So what's needed, really on my conviction is we need good policy. We need it, we just need good policy. It's not about that policy or legislation is always going to be preventing business. It's about what policies it needs. Let government create the enabling environment for business to do the right job and not get into the actual business decisions. It's that fine line between how do you make it possible and how do you dictate. So that can be standards, legislation, programs, training, restrictions, for example, on city access for trucks, or in times of providing better parking. But the one that I think is most important is really the infrastructure. So let me give you an example. In Netherlands, the government has really invested in subsidies for electric vehicles. And then they got traction, and then, oops, the infrastructure is not there. So what's really needed there is for the government to think much more ahead of the game, where business is not yet quite ready to invest, and make sure that once business does go up the curve, that the infrastructure is there and the legal framework is there to support its uptake. Final, no, I think, yeah, 2 more slides. This one I wanted to show, and this is the Logistics Performance Index by the World Bank. They do this every 5 years or so, and they compare with questionnaires and surveys how is the logistics system or logistics sector doing in different countries. You got 3 types. You got the low middle income countries like Nigeria, for example, or Bolivia, where they've got quite low LPIs, and they are, like I met a deputy minister from Nigeria, and he was saying, look, Sophie, we can talk about intermodal, but let's just first get good roads. Yeah, so a totally different ballgame. Then you've got the ones in the middle, the tier 2, they're the fast-growing countries, whereby, say in China and India, you get so much investments in roads and rail, but it's so unplanned because they're trying to just catch up to the demand and the growth, that they haven't really thought through like how we're going to make sure to design them in a way that it works for the future and we get efficiency from the outset. And the tier 1 is the mature economies, and that includes New Zealand. And what that means is that you have every opportunity to build on your existing infrastructure and to go to the innovation. It's about electrification, it's about making use of ICT, it's about making the connections between different modes optimized. And so I think, radio presenter Catherine, she asked, yeah, but New Zealand is small and we've got long distance. I said, no excuses, you've got everything going for you. It's got to be done, and you have an advantage over so many other countries that I know. For one, you have only 1 piece of legislation. In Europe, we have like 26 countries, and EU, very difficult. So what's needed? We need to make sure that in the government climate commitments, we have freight included. New Zealand has also submitted an INDC, which is like a national plan that if the Paris Agreement gets ratified, they have to implement it. freight's not in it, or maybe it's just mentioned, but most countries have not considered freight. Secondly, I really would like to, my ask to you is, can we articulate what is it that business wants on freight from government and not? Let's be clear collectively about what would be good for government's role to be, because I hear often from government saying, we will act when business asks us to, so let's ask it. Yeah? And finally, is supporting development of national roadmaps. I really think New Zealand would need a roadmap to understand how we're going to get to the 30% emissions reduction. And finally, we need city freight plans. Auckland needs one, Wellington needs one. I've been to both those cities in the past few days. There's really an opportunity to improve the freight systems there. And a lot of countries have gone ahead of you. My favorite one so far is London. I think they've done a fantastic job. And what triggered them was the Olympics. So I think we just need to get the Rugby World Cup here again, and we can do it too. Main takeaway, freight efficiency and environment sustainability is an opportunity. It's not a risk, not a danger, it's an opportunity. Business wants it because it saves them money. The environment wants it because we need emissions. This is the area while I fell in love with this sector, because I see the enormous opportunity to improve and make it a win-win for everyone. It's just the how to get there. It's the barriers that both companies and others face to achieve it. And it's about overcoming the barriers. It's not about really building the business case as much. It's more the how. But what we need, leadership across the board, not just from business. We need it from government, we need it from civil society, we even need it from consumers. And we need collaboration between them to grasp it. So with that, thank you very much.
Just go backwards.